In the autumn of 1987, 24-year-old Richard Chen disappeared while working the closing shift at Henderson Electronics in Madison, Wisconsin. A recent engineering graduate who had just started his first real job, Richard never made it home that October night. 36 years later, in the fall of 2023, advanced genealogical DNA analysis finally identified the person responsible. The breakthrough came when a distant cousin uploaded their genetic profile to a public ancestry database, creating a family tree connection that investigators had been unable to establish through traditional methods. What made this case particularly devastating was the identity of Richard's killer. Someone who had stood beside Richard's grieving parents during the search. Someone who had helped distribute missing person flyers throughout the neighborhood. Someone Richard's mother had invited to Thanksgiving dinner just 3 weeks before his disappearance. If you're interested in more true crime stories like this, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell so you never miss an episode. The call came into the Madison Police Department's cold case unit on a crisp Tuesday morning in October 2023. Detective Sarah Morrison had been reviewing the Chen file for the third time that month when her phone rang. Detective Morrison, this is Linda Huang from the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. I have results on that genealogical DNA analysis you requested for the Richard Chen case. Sarah sat up straighter in her chair. She had submitted the DNA sample 18 months earlier, extracted from blood found on Richard's work vest. The vest had been stored in evidence for 36 years, the blood carefully preserved through advances in forensic storage protocols that didn't exist in 1987. We found a familial match, Linda continued. Third cousin on the maternal side. From there, we were able to build out a family tree. It took 6 months of genealogical research, but we have a suspect name. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her pen. Go ahead. Michael Preston, born 1959 in Milwaukee. He would have been 28 at the time of Richard's disappearance. The name hit Sarah like ice water. She pulled up the original case file on her computer, scrolling through the interview records. There it was. Michael Preston had been interviewed twice during the original investigation. He had organized search parties. He had maintained contact with the Chen family for years. Are you certain? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. 99.7% probability match. The DNA under Richard's fingernails and the blood on his vest both match the same profile, and that profile leads directly to Michael Preston through confirmed genealogical analysis. Sarah closed the file folder in front of her. She had memorized every detail anyway. Send me everything you have. I need to brief my lieutenant. Madison, Wisconsin, in October 1987, felt like a city on the edge of something. The Brewers had made it to the playoffs. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold. Students at the University of Wisconsin flooded State Street every weekend, their laughter echoing off brick buildings that had stood since the 1800s. Richard Chen had moved to Madison 3 months earlier, fresh out of the University of Illinois, with a degree in electrical engineering. Henderson Electronics, a mid-sized company that manufactured circuit boards for industrial equipment, had offered him a position as a junior engineer. The salary was modest, but fair. The work was challenging. The future looked bright. He lived in a small one-bedroom apartment on Langdon Street, within walking distance of the Capitol building. His neighbors had mixed feelings about him. Most found him polite, but distant, the kind of person who held doors and helped carry groceries, but never quite connected on a personal level. On Sunday mornings, he could be heard practicing violin. The music drifted through thin walls, Bach and Mozart rendered with more determination than talent, the same difficult passages repeated until neighbors winced. Mrs. Kowalski in 2B had complained twice to the building manager about the noise. "It's not even good playing," she had said. "Just the same mistakes over and over. Some of us are trying to sleep on Sunday mornings." Richard had apologized, adjusted his practice schedule to later in the day, but the incident left a small residue of resentment that neighbors would later remember when police came asking questions. At Henderson Electronics, Richard worked in the testing department. His job was to examine newly manufactured circuit boards, checking for defects before they were shipped to customers. It was meticulous work that required patience and attention to detail. Richard approached it with an almost obsessive precision that impressed his supervisors, but sometimes irritated his co-workers. Tom Brennan, a senior engineer who had worked at Henderson for 15 years, found Richard's perfectionism exhausting. "The kid's good," Tom told another co-worker over coffee one morning, "but he makes everyone else look bad. Yesterday, he found a defect in a board I had already approved, made a whole production about documenting it, going to the supervisor. Technically, he was right, but Jesus, nobody likes a guy who can't let anything slide." Richard's parents, Helen and David Chen, had emigrated from Taiwan in 1961. They ran a small Chinese restaurant in Chicago's Chinatown neighborhood, working 16-hour days to put Richard and his younger sister through school. Richard called them every Sunday evening, without fail, to check in and share news about his week. These calls were a mixture of duty and genuine affection, though Richard sometimes felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him like a physical force. His father wanted him to come home to Chicago, to work for a major company there, to be close to family. "Madison is too small," David would say. "Big companies in Chicago need engineers, better opportunities." But Richard had chosen Madison precisely because it was small, because it gave him space to figure out who he was without the constant oversight of family expectations. He loved his parents deeply, but he also needed distance from the immigrant success narrative they had written for him before he was born. Richard's girlfriend, Jennifer Wu, understood this tension. She was a graduate student at UW-Madison studying biochemistry, the daughter of immigrants herself, caught between honoring her parents and building her own life. She and Richard had met at a community orchestra rehearsal 2 months earlier. Jennifer played cello with far more natural talent than Richard brought to his violin, but she appreciated his dedication to improvement. Their relationship was still new, still in that phase where every conversation revealed something unexpected. Just 3 days before Richard disappeared, they had stayed up until 2 a.m, talking about their families, their dreams, the pressure they both felt to be perfect children for parents who had sacrificed everything. "Sometimes I want to just be mediocre at something," Richard had said, "just to see what it feels like not to care about being the best." Jennifer had laughed. "You wouldn't last a week. You'd end up trying to be the best at being mediocre." The memory of that conversation would haunt her for decades. At Henderson Electronics, Michael Preston was the facilities manager. He had worked there for 7 years, responsible for building maintenance, security, and overseeing the cleaning crew. At 28, he was considered reliable and hardworking by management. He lived alone in a house in the suburb of Monona, drove a blue Ford pickup truck, and was known for helping out co-workers with various tasks. What no one at Henderson knew was that Michael Preston had been having violent fantasies since he was 14 years old. They started small. Thoughts about hurting animals that he never acted on. Daydreams about controlling someone, watching them beg. By the time he was 18, the fantasies had evolved into detailed scenarios about killing someone, hiding the body, getting away with it. Michael had never told anyone about these thoughts. He had learned early to keep certain parts of himself hidden, to present the face people expected to see. He was good at it. Great at it, actually. People thought he was nice, helpful, a little quiet maybe, but dependable. The fantasies disturbed him at first. He wondered if he was crazy, if something was fundamentally broken inside him. He had tried to make them stop. At 19, he had dated a girl named Susan for 6 months, thinking maybe a normal relationship would fix whatever was wrong with him. But even during intimate moments with Susan, his mind would drift to violence. He would imagine his hands around her throat instead of caressing her face. The thoughts terrified him, and he ended the relationship abruptly, giving her some excuse about not being ready for commitment. At 23, Michael had considered seeing a therapist. He had even called a mental health clinic, sitting in his truck in the parking lot with a phone book open to the listings. But what would he say? That he thought about killing people? What if they reported him? What if he lost his job? He hung up the phone before anyone answered. As years passed, and he never acted on the thoughts, Michael began to believe he had it under control. They were just fantasies, he told himself. Lots of people had dark thoughts they never acted on. He had read somewhere that intrusive thoughts were normal, that the human mind generated all kinds of disturbing ideas that didn't reflect actual desires. But Michael knew, deep down, that his thoughts were different. They weren't intrusive. They were desired. He sought them out, cultivated them, refined them. He would lie in bed at night imagining scenarios in precise detail. The approach, the attack, the disposal of evidence, the aftermath. He told himself there was a line between thinking and doing. And as long as he stayed on the thinking side of that line, he wasn't really hurting anyone. But the thoughts never went away. They intensified, and Michael found himself studying people, evaluating them, imagining scenarios, not planning exactly, just thinking about how it might happen, if he ever decided to do it. He noticed who worked alone, who stayed late, who was small enough to overpower easily. He didn't write any of this down. He didn't need to. It was all filed away in his mind, a mental catalog of potential victims that he told himself he would never actually use. Richard Chen wasn't special to Michael. He wasn't a target in any meaningful sense. Richard was simply someone who fit certain criteria that Michael had been unconsciously collecting. He worked late sometimes. He was new to Madison, without deep roots or close friends. He was small-framed, maybe 150 pounds. He was kind in a way that suggested he might not immediately recognize danger. Richard was vulnerable in a way that made Michael's thoughts crystallize into something more concrete than fantasy. In the weeks before October 23rd, Michael found himself thinking about Richard more often, not obsessively, but regularly, noting Richard's schedule, observing his routines, learning that he sometimes worked overtime on Fridays. Michael told himself he was just observing, just collecting information. It didn't mean he was actually going to do anything. But on October 23rd, 1987, when Michael manufactured a reason to work late, when he brought rope with him to the building, when he parked his truck in a secluded corner of the lot, he knew he was lying to himself. Tonight was the night he was going to find out what it felt like to cross the line from fantasy into reality. October 23rd, 1987, was a Friday. Richard had drawn the late shift that week, working until 9 p.m. to monitor a test run on a new circuit board design. The overtime pay would help him save faster for the professional quality violin he wanted, a Stradivarius copy that cost $3,000 at a music store downtown. That morning, Richard called his mother from his apartment. It was earlier than his usual Sunday call, but he had exciting news. Tom Brennan, the senior engineer who Richard had inadvertently embarrassed with the defect discovery, had actually apologized to Richard the previous day. "He said I was right to catch the mistake," Richard told Helen in Mandarin. "Said that's what good engineers do. I think maybe we can be friends now." Helen was pleased but cautious. "Be careful not to make people feel bad when you correct them. It's important to be right, but also important to let people keep their dignity." Richard promised he would try. The advice sat in his mind as he went about his morning, practicing violin for 30 minutes before work. He was working on Bach's Partita No. 2, specifically the Chaconne movement, which was far beyond his current skill level. But Richard believed in reaching for difficult things. That's how you improved. Mrs. Kowalski in 2B knocked on his door at 10:15 a.m. She was holding a plate of cookies. "I wanted to apologize," she said stiffly, "for complaining about your violin. My husband reminded me that you're always very quiet otherwise, and you did change your practice time when I asked. These are by way of apology." Richard was touched by the gesture. He thanked her, invited her in for tea, which she declined, but the interaction left him feeling better about his place in the building. Maybe he was making connections in Madison after all. He arrived at Henderson Electronics just before 1 p.m., parking his red Honda Civic in his usual spot near the back of the lot. The autumn day was crisp, temperature in the low 50s, the kind of weather that made Madison beautiful. Leaves crunched under his feet as he walked to the employee entrance. Inside, the building hummed with the familiar sounds of a Friday afternoon winding down. People were making weekend plans, their voices carrying through the hallways with an energy that weekdays lacked. Richard clocked in at 1 p.m. sharp and headed to his workstation in the testing lab. The space was organized exactly the way he liked it, everything in its place, tools arranged by function and frequency of use. Some of his coworkers joked that he had OCD, but Richard preferred to think of it as efficiency. The circuit boards he would be testing were for a new industrial refrigeration control system. Any defect could cause equipment failures costing tens of thousands of dollars. Richard took the responsibility seriously, perhaps more seriously than the job required. Around 2 p.m., Tom Brennan stopped by Richard's station. The apology from the previous day had cleared the air between them, and Tom seemed genuinely friendly now. "Working late tonight?" Tom asked, seeing Richard's schedule on the board. "Yeah, monitoring the overnight test run, overtime pay." Tom nodded. "Just be careful leaving. This neighborhood gets sketchy after dark. Keep your eyes open in the parking lot." "I will. Thanks." Tom hesitated, as if deciding whether to say something else. "Listen, you want to grab a beer sometime? There's a group of us that goes to the Old-Fashioned on Friday nights sometimes. You should come." Richard felt a small surge of pleasure. An invitation, a sign that he was being accepted, not just tolerated. "Yeah, I'd like that. Next Friday then. I'll let you know details." After Tom left, Richard returned to his work with slightly more energy. Maybe Madison was going to work out after all. Maybe he could build a life here. At 3 p.m., another visitor arrived at Richard's workstation. Dale Kowalski, a technician from the manufacturing floor. Dale was 32, had worked at Henderson for 9 years, and had a reputation for borrowing money and not paying it back. "Hey, Chen, got a second?" Dale's voice had an edge Richard couldn't quite identify. "Sure. What do you need?" Dale glanced around, making sure they were alone. "Look, I know this is awkward, but I'm in a bit of a bind. Could you spot me $200 until next week? I've got a situation and I'm tapped out." Richard felt uncomfortable. He barely knew Dale, had maybe spoken to him 3 times. "I don't really have that kind of money to lend right now. I'm saving for something specific." Dale's expression hardened. Come on, man. I know you engineering guys make more than us floor workers. It's just a week. It's not about whether I have it. I just don't feel comfortable lending money to someone I don't know well. I'm sorry. Fine, Dale said sharply. Forget I asked. He left the testing lab with heavy footsteps, and Richard felt the residue of tension the interaction had created. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he also sensed he had made an enemy, small as it might be. What Richard didn't know was that Dale Kowalski was in serious trouble. He owed money to some very unpleasant people, the kind who didn't accept next week as an answer. And now this kid, this new engineer who probably came from money, had just turned him down flat. At 6 p.m., Richard took his dinner break. He heated up leftover stir-fry that Jennifer had made, ate alone in the break room while reading his violin technique book. Through the window, he could see his car in the parking lot, the red Honda catching the last light of the setting sun. By 7 p.m., the building had emptied considerably. The day shift was gone. The second shift in manufacturing was running, but those workers stayed in their wing of the building. Richard was effectively alone in the testing area. Michael Preston had been in the building since 4 p.m. He had told his supervisor he needed to replace a failing fluorescent light in the testing lab, a job that would take a couple of hours given the wiring issues he had diagnosed earlier in the week. But the light didn't really need replacing. Not urgently, anyway. Michael had manufactured the issue, told his supervisor it was a safety problem that should be addressed before the weekend. And his supervisor, trusting Michael's judgment, had approved the overtime. Michael worked slowly on the light, stretching the job out. He had brought his tools, his ladder, everything he needed. But he kept pausing, listening to the sounds of the building, tracking the pattern of people leaving. By 7:30 p.m., Michael knew he was running out of time. Richard's shift ended at 9. If Michael was going to do this, if he was going to cross the line from fantasy into reality, it had to be tonight. He finished installing the light, testing it twice to make sure it worked. Then he cleaned up his tools, putting everything away in his truck except for one item: a length of rope, 1/4 inch diameter, which he coiled carefully and placed in his jacket pocket. Michael walked to the testing lab where Richard was working. The fluorescent light he had just installed cast harsh shadows across the room. Richard looked up from his circuit board examination, surprised to see someone else in the building at this hour. "Hey, Michael, didn't know you were here. Just finished that light installation. Wanted to make sure it's working okay. You notice any flickering?" Richard glanced up at the new light. "No, looks good. Thanks for fixing it." Michael lingered, watching Richard work. This was the moment where he could turn around, go home, continue living his life as someone who only thought about violence but never committed it. "You working until 9? Michael asked. "Yeah, long shift, but the overtime helps." "I hear you. Well, I'm heading out. Have a good weekend." "You too." Michael left the testing lab. He walked down the hallway toward the exit. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His hands were shaking. He could still walk away. He could still choose not to do this. But instead, Michael Preston walked to his truck, moved it to a darker corner of the parking lot, and settled in to wait for Richard Chen to finish his shift. The initial investigation into Richard Chen's disappearance moved with surprising speed. Madison police took Jennifer Wu's missing person report seriously, despite the short time frame. Richard's behavior was too out of character. He had never stood anyone up before. He always called if plans changed. Something was wrong. Detective James Kowalski arrived at Henderson Electronics around 1 a.m. on Saturday, October 24th. At 47, he was a 20-year veteran of the Madison PD, with a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession. His wife had stopped waiting up for him years ago, understanding that some cases took precedence over everything else. Richard's car sat in the employee parking lot, unlocked. Keys in the ignition. Wallet on the passenger seat containing $43 and a photo of his parents. Work badge clipped to the sun visor. No signs of struggle. No blood. No broken glass. The car simply waited there, as if Richard had meant to return to it any moment. Inside the building, Richard's workstation told a similar story of interrupted normalcy. Circuit boards neatly arranged, thermos of tea beside his notebook, jacket hanging on the back of his chair, his violin technique book lying open to a chapter on improving intonation. Kowalski photographed everything, his mind already building theories and discarding them. Robbery. But the wallet with cash was still in the car. Voluntary disappearance. Nothing in Richard's life suggested that kind of impulsivity. Random violence? Possible. But where was the evidence of confrontation? Bag everything as evidence, Kowalski told the responding officers. I want prints from the car, from the door handles, from the wallet. Everything. The security guard, Walter Hughes, sat in the break room looking shaken. He was 67, a retired city maintenance worker supplementing his pension with overnight security shifts. He remembered Richard clocking out at 9:03 p.m., but hadn't actually seen him leave the building. The rear exit doesn't have cameras? Kowalski asked. Budget cuts, Walter said apologetically. We only have cameras on the front entrance and the loading dock. Kowalski reviewed the security footage. The last clear image of Richard Chen showed him walking past the front desk at 7:45 p.m., carrying his empty lunch container to the break room. After that, nothing. But there was footage of Michael Preston. The facilities manager appeared on camera at 7:32 p.m., leaving through the front entrance carrying his toolbox. His time card showed he had clocked out at 7:35 p.m. Kowalski made a note. Preston would need to be interviewed, along with everyone else who had been in the building that night. By dawn Saturday, Kowalski had assembled a preliminary timeline and a list of people to interview. He started with Jennifer Wu, not because he suspected her involvement, but because she knew Richard best. Jennifer arrived at the police station at 8 a.m., her eyes red from crying. She had spent the entire night calling Richard's apartment, each unanswered ring tightening the knot of fear in her stomach. Tell me about your relationship with Richard, Kowalski said gently. Any problems? Arguments? No. We were happy. We were planning to go to Door County in the spring. Jennifer's voice cracked. He was talking about introducing me to his parents at Christmas. Did Richard mention anyone bothering him? Anyone who made him uncomfortable? Jennifer thought carefully. There was a guy at work who asked to borrow money. Richard said no, and the guy got angry about it. Dale something. Kowalski wrote down the name. Dale Kowalski? I think so. Richard said he felt bad about saying no, but he didn't really know the guy well enough to lend him money. This was interesting. A confrontation over money, however minor, created a potential motive. Anyone else? Any problems with neighbors, former girlfriends? Anyone? His neighbor complained about his violin playing, but they made up. He seemed really happy about that, actually. Said she brought him cookies. Kowalski continued the interview for another hour, building a picture of Richard's life in Madison. A young man trying to find his place in a new city, making some mistakes, some friends, some small enemies, living an ordinary life that had been violently interrupted. At 10 a.m., Kowalski drove to Dale Kowalski's apartment. No relation despite the shared last name, which the detective had already verified. Dale lived in a rundown complex on Madison's east side, the kind of place where people minded their own business and nobody called the police unless absolutely necessary. Dale answered the door in a bathrobe, clearly hungover or still drunk. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements unsteady. Dale Kowalski? Yeah, who's asking? Detective James Kowalski, Madison PD. I need to ask you some questions about Richard Chen. Something flickered across Dale's face. Fear? Guilt? Recognition? What about him? He's missing. When was the last time you saw him? Dale's jaw tightened. Friday afternoon. Why? Can I come in? Dale hesitated, then stepped aside. The apartment was a disaster. Empty beer cans, pizza boxes, clothes everywhere. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and something worse. You asked Richard to loan you money on Friday, Kowalski said. It wasn't a question. So what? Lots of people ask friends for money. Were you friends with Richard? Friend, co-worker, whatever. Look, I needed some cash. He said no. End of story. How did that make you feel? Dale's expression turned hostile. How do you think? I was pissed. But I didn't do anything to him if that's what you're suggesting. Where were you Friday night between 9 p.m. and midnight? Here, drinking, alone. Can anyone verify that? No. Dale crossed his arms defensively. Look, I was mad at the kid for about 10 minutes. Then I went home, got drunk, passed out. That's it. I didn't touch him. Kowalski made notes, studying Dale's body language. The man was defensive, angry, maybe hiding something. But did he seem like someone who had committed murder? Kowalski wasn't sure yet. How much money did you owe, and to whom? Dale's face went white. That's none of your business. It is if it's connected to a missing person case. I didn't do anything to Richard, Dale said again, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. Kowalski left Dale's apartment with more questions than answers. Dale Kowalski had motive, however slight. He had opportunity. He didn't have an alibi, but something didn't fit. If Dale had killed Richard over $200, why leave Richard's wallet with $43 in the car? At noon, Kowalski interviewed Michael Preston at the Henderson Electronics offices. Preston had come in on his day off when he heard about Richard's disappearance, offering to help however he could. I can't believe this, Michael said, shaking his head. Richard seemed like such a good kid. You saw him Friday night? Yeah, around 7:30. I had just finished installing a light in the testing lab. Stopped by to make sure it was working properly. What was Richard doing? Testing circuit boards. He seemed fine. Normal. We talked for maybe 2 minutes. Did he mention any concerns? Anyone bothering him? Michael thought for a moment, his expression carefully concerned. Not that I remember. He said something about working overtime to save money for a violin. That's about it. And you left the building when? Around 7:35. Clocked out, went home. Did you see Richard's car in the parking lot when you left? Yeah, it was there, the red Honda. But I didn't think anything of it. He still had an hour and a half on his shift. Kowalski took notes, watching Preston's body language. The facilities manager appeared concerned, helpful, appropriately worried about a missing coworker. Nothing about his demeanor raised red flags. Do you live alone, Mr. Preston? Yes. Can anyone verify what time you got home Friday night? No, I live alone, like I said. Michael met Kowalski's eyes steadily. I got home around 8:15, made dinner, watched TV, went to bed. Pretty boring Friday night, but that's the truth. Kowalski nodded. No alibi, but that wasn't unusual for people who lived alone. If you think of anything else that might be relevant, please call me. Of course. I really hope you find him. Richard was a nice guy. After Michael left, Kowalski sat in the empty office reviewing his notes. He had interviewed a dozen people so far. Most had alibis. Some didn't. None of them particularly stood out as obvious suspects. But something was nagging at him. The lack of evidence of struggle. The wallet left in the car. The keys in the ignition. It suggested Richard had been planning to return to his car quickly, or that someone had made it look that way. Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation expanded. Volunteers distributed flyers throughout Madison. Richard's photo appeared on television and in newspapers. His parents arrived from Chicago, devastated and desperate for answers. Kowalski pursued every lead with relentless energy. He interviewed Richard's neighbors, looking for anyone who might have had a grudge. Mrs. Kowalski in 2B told him about the violin complaint, then showed him the plate of cookies she had brought as an apology. He was very gracious about it, she said. I felt terrible for complaining. He was just trying to improve himself. The detail of the cookies haunted Kowalski. Richard's last normal day had included a small act of reconciliation with a neighbor, and then, hours later, he had vanished. Dale Kowalski remained a person of interest. The detective discovered that Dale owed money to a loan shark named Frank Russo, a mid-level criminal who operated out of Milwaukee. When questioned, Russo admitted that Dale owed him $5,000, but claimed he had nothing to do with Richard Chen. I collect debts, not bodies, Russo said. Bad for business. Nevertheless, Kowalski kept pressure on Dale, interviewing him 3 more times over the following weeks. Dale's story never changed. He had been angry at Richard, had gone home and gotten drunk, had nothing to do with his disappearance. On November 7th, 15 days after Richard vanished, Kowalski received a tip through the Crime Stoppers hotline. A woman who worked at a gas station on East Washington Avenue claimed she had seen Richard on the night of October 23rd. He came in around 9:30, she said. I remember because he seemed upset about something, kept looking over his shoulder. This contradicted the timeline. Richard had clocked out at 9:03. By 9:30, he should have been at the coffee shop meeting Jennifer. Unless he had gone somewhere else first. Kowalski drove to the gas station, interviewed the clerk again, showed her multiple photos. She pointed to Richard with certainty. That's him. I'm sure of it. But when Kowalski pressed for details, the story began to fall apart. What had Richard been wearing? The clerk couldn't remember. What had he purchased? She thought maybe cigarettes, but Richard didn't smoke. Had he driven up in a car? She wasn't sure. Eventually, the clerk admitted she had seen so many people that night, she might be confusing Richard with someone else. The lead evaporated, leaving Kowalski frustrated and exhausted. Michael Preston organized search parties that combed through parks and wooded areas near Henderson Electronics. He suggested searching Cherokee Marsh, a wetland area where people sometimes dumped things they wanted hidden. He spent his personal days helping coordinate volunteers, distributing flyers, doing everything a concerned co-worker should do. When Helen and David Chen arrived from Chicago, Michael approached them carefully at one of the organized searches. I'm so sorry about Richard, he told them. He was a good person. Everyone at Henderson liked him. Helen gripped his hand, tears streaming down her face. Thank you for helping. Thank you for caring about my son. David studied Michael with the careful assessment of a man who had learned to read people across cultural and language barriers. He saw only kindness in the younger man's face, only genuine concern. You are a good man, David said in his heavily accented English. Richard lucky to have friend like you. Michael accepted their gratitude with appropriate humility. Inside, something twisted. Not quite guilt, but a strange dissonance between the grief he was witnessing and the knowledge that he had caused it. At night, alone in his house, Michael would replay the moment of Richard's death. The surprise on Richard's face when Michael grabbed him in the parking lot. The struggle, the way Richard had clawed at Michael's arms, drawing blood. The moment when resistance stopped and Richard went limp. Michael had expected to feel satisfaction. The fantasies had always ended in a kind of dark euphoria, a sense of power and control. But the reality had been messier, less clean. Richard had been a person, not an abstract victim in a fantasy, and killing him had been mechanical, almost disappointing in its ordinariness. Still, Michael had crossed a line. He had done something most people only thought about in their darkest moments, and the world had not ended. He was getting away with it. The investigation continued for months. Detective Kowalski pursued leads with diminishing hope. A psychic called claiming to know where Richard's body was buried. The location turned out to be empty. Another caller reported seeing Richard in Minneapolis, working at a restaurant under a different name. That lead also proved false. In March 1988, construction workers found human remains in Cherokee Marsh. For a terrible 48 hours, everyone believed they had found Richard Chen. But dental records proved otherwise. It was a different victim, a different tragedy, a different family who would now receive devastating closure. Dale Kowalski remained Kowalski's primary suspect for months. The detective couldn't shake the feeling that the money dispute mattered more than it appeared. But without evidence, without a body, without anything concrete, Dale couldn't be charged. By the one-year anniversary of Richard's disappearance, the case had gone cold. Detective James Kowalski had worked it as hard as any case in his career, but the leads had dried up. The file sat on his desk, a reminder of failure, of a young man who deserved better. Michael Preston continued living his unremarkable life. He worked at Henderson Electronics until 1994, then took a job at a hospital in Milwaukee. He married in 1992, divorced in 1998. He maintained contact with Helen and David Chen, calling every few months to check in, to remind them he hadn't forgotten their son. And in his quiet moments, alone with his thoughts, Michael would sometimes wonder if he should confess. If living with the secret was worse than facing the consequences. But he never did. Time passed, and it became easier to pretend the murder hadn't happened. To live as if he were the helpful facilities manager everyone thought he was, not a killer who had gotten away with murder. The years turned to decades. Richard Chen became a cold case, one of hundreds that haunted police departments across America. A file in a cabinet, a photo on a memorial wall. A name that fewer and fewer people recognized as time eroded the memory of who he had been. Until 2023, when science finally caught up with Michael Preston's secret. The genealogical DNA analysis that identified Michael Preston was the culmination of months of painstaking work. Detective Sarah Morrison had submitted the blood evidence in 2021, hopeful, but not certain it would yield results. The sample went to a specialized lab that could extract DNA from degraded biological material. Then it was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public database where people voluntarily shared their genetic information to find relatives and explore their ancestry. The first hit was a third cousin of the unknown subject, not close enough for a direct identification, but close enough to start building a family tree. That's where Patricia Weaver came in. A genetic genealogist who had helped solve 17 cold cases. Patricia took on the Chen case in January 2023. She started with the third cousin match and began constructing family trees, working backward through generations. It was detective work of a different kind. Birth certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries. Each piece of information helped fill in the branches of a tree that eventually pointed to a small cluster of possible suspects. By August 2023, Patricia had narrowed it to 3 men who would have been in their late 20s in 1987 and living in the Madison area. She gave the names to Sarah Morrison. One of them was Michael Preston. Sarah pulled the original case file and felt her pulse quicken as she read through Michael's interviews. He had been there. He had been in the building that night. He had organized searches. He had maintained contact with the family for years. "We need a warrant for a DNA sample," Sarah told her lieutenant. The warrant was approved within 24 hours. On a Tuesday morning in October 2023, Sarah and her partner knocked on Michael Preston's door. Michael answered in a bathrobe, coffee mug in hand. When he saw the badges, something flickered across his face. Not surprise exactly, something closer to resignation. "Michael Preston?" "Yes. I'm Detective Sarah Morrison, Madison PD. This is Detective Tom Reeves. We have a warrant to collect a DNA sample in connection with the 1987 disappearance of Richard Chen." Michael set down his coffee mug. His hands were steady. "I see." He didn't ask questions, didn't protest, simply opened his mouth when the swab approached, allowing the sample to be collected without resistance. "We'll be in touch," Sarah said, studying his reaction. "I'm sure you will," Michael replied quietly. The DNA comparison came back in 3 days. Perfect match. Michael Preston's DNA matched the blood on Richard Chen's work vest and the material found under Richard's fingernails. Sarah Morrison led the arrest team herself. On a bright Thursday morning, they returned to Michael's house with handcuffs and a murder warrant. This time, Michael was ready. He opened the door already dressed, as if he had been expecting them. "Michael Preston, you're under arrest for the murder of Richard Chen." As Sarah read him his Miranda rights, Michael stood quietly, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't proclaim his innocence. He simply held out his wrists for the handcuffs. At the Madison police station, Michael sat in an interview room for 3 hours before speaking. "I want to tell you what happened," he finally said. Sarah leaned forward. "I need to remind you that you have the right to an attorney." "I know. I don't want one. I want to tell you what happened to Richard Chen. I've been carrying it for 36 years. I'm done carrying it." The confession that followed was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that sent chills through everyone who heard it. Michael Preston sat across from Sarah Morrison and Tom Reeves in interview room 3, a space designed to be deliberately uncomfortable. Harsh fluorescent lighting, no windows, a table bolted to the floor, the kind of place that was supposed to make people want to confess just to escape it. But Michael seemed perfectly comfortable. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral. When he spoke, his voice was steady, almost conversational. "I killed Richard Chen on October 23, 1987, he began. "I had been thinking about killing someone for years. Richard just happened to be the person I chose." Sarah felt her skin crawl at the casualness of the statement. Chose. As if Richard had been an item selected from a menu. "Walk us through what happened that night," Sarah said, keeping her voice professional despite the rage building in her chest. Michael nodded, as if this were a perfectly reasonable request. "I told my supervisor I needed to replace a light in the testing lab. It was a Friday, and I knew Richard had the late shift. I brought rope with me, the kind we used for securing equipment, 1/4-inch diameter, strong enough to hold weight." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. Not because he was lying, Sarah realized, but because he wanted to be accurate. I installed the light. That part was real. I wanted to make sure my reason for being there was legitimate if anyone asked. Then I waited. I parked my truck in a corner of the lot where the security cameras wouldn't see it. I knew where all the cameras were. Part of my job. "What time did Richard leave the building?" Reeves asked. 9:03. I saw him clock out on the time card system. We had a monitor in the maintenance office that showed clock-ins and clock-outs. I waited in the parking lot, near his car, but out of sight. Michael's eyes took on a distant quality, as if he were watching a movie of that night playing in his mind. When Richard came out, I approached him. I told him there was a problem with the light I had installed, that I needed him to check something technical. Richard was always helpful. He cared about doing things right. He came back inside with me. Sarah's hands clenched under the table. Richard's kindness, his desire to help, had been weaponized against him. We went back to the testing lab. I showed him the light, had him look at it. While he was looking up, I came up behind him with the rope. "Did he fight?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from the DNA evidence. "Yes, he fought hard, harder than I expected." Michael rolled up his sleeve, showing faint scars on his forearm. "These are from his fingernails. He scratched deep enough to draw blood. He grabbed my face too, left marks. I told people at work the next day that I had fallen off a ladder." The matter-of-fact way Michael described Richard's desperate fight for life was nauseating. Sarah forced herself to stay focused. "What happened after?" "It took about 3 minutes for him to stop struggling. I know because I looked at the clock afterward. 3 minutes. It felt longer at the time, but it was 3 minutes." Michael's expression didn't change. "When he was dead, I felt strange, not satisfied, not horrified, just strange, like I had crossed some invisible line and the world should have changed, but everything looked exactly the same." He continued describing the disposal of Richard's body with the same clinical detachment. The plastic sheeting from the maintenance supply room, the drive to the forest, the burial in a pre-selected location, the return to Madison, the cleaning of his truck, the disposal of bloody clothes in a dumpster behind a restaurant 20 miles away. "Why that specific location in the forest?" Reeves asked. "I had gone hunting there before. I knew the area. I knew there was a spot about a quarter-mile off the main trail that nobody visited. I had actually thought about it before that night. If I ever did kill someone, that's where I would bury them." The premeditation was chilling. This wasn't an impulsive act of violence. Michael had been preparing for it, mentally, if not consciously, for a long time. "The next day was Saturday," Michael continued. "I woke up and half expected police to be at my door. But they weren't. I went to the grocery store. I mowed my lawn. It was a normal Saturday, and I realized I was probably going to get away with it." "How did that make you feel?" Sarah asked. Michael thought about this for a long moment. Relieved and disappointed. I had built it up so much in my mind. The forbidden thing, the ultimate transgression. But the reality was just mechanics. A person fighting, a person dying, a body to hide. There was no transcendence, no revelation, just mess and work and stress about getting caught. "But you stayed involved with the investigation," Sarah said. "You helped search for Richard. You maintained contact with his family. Why?" "2 reasons," Michael said. "First, I thought it would make me look innocent. A guilty person wouldn't help search for the victim, right? That's what I figured, and it worked. Nobody suspected me. And second," Michael's expression shifted slightly, the first hint of something resembling emotion. "I wanted to know if they were getting close, If anyone suspected me, staying involved gave me access to information. I could hear what the police were finding or not finding. It let me stay ahead of the investigation. You never felt guilty? Sarah's voice was harder now. You never thought about confessing? Sometimes, Michael admitted. Especially in the first few months. The weight of it was heavy. I would see Richard's parents on television, begging for information, and I would think about calling them, telling them where he was, giving them closure. But you didn't. No, because I knew that would mean prison, maybe death penalty, and I didn't want that. The guilt wasn't strong enough to override self-preservation, so I just learned to live with it. It got easier over time. The memory became less sharp. I started to almost forget it had happened. He paused. Until you showed up with that DNA warrant. Then I knew it was over. And honestly, there was relief in that too. Carrying the secret for 36 years was exhausting. Part of me was glad to finally put it down. Sarah stared at him, trying to understand how a human being could be so fundamentally broken. Michael Preston looked normal. He sounded normal. But the way he talked about murder, about Richard's death, was like someone describing a minor car accident. Factual, detached, empty of appropriate emotion. Do you feel remorse now? Sarah asked. Michael considered the question seriously. I understand that what I did was wrong. I understand that I destroyed lives. Richard's life, his parents' lives, his girlfriend's life, all the people who cared about him. I understand that intellectually. But you don't feel it. No, Michael said simply. I don't feel it. I know I should, but I don't. The psychiatric evaluation that followed described Michael Preston as having antisocial personality disorder with psychopathic traits. He showed limited capacity for empathy or remorse. The murder appeared to have been a manifestation of violent fantasies he had harbored since adolescence. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the court-appointed psychiatrist, no relation to Richard, wrote in her report, Mr. Preston demonstrates a profound disconnection between his actions and their impact on others. He understands intellectually that what he did was wrong, but he does not experience appropriate emotional response to the harm he caused. His primary regret appears to be that the experience did not provide the satisfaction he had anticipated. Sarah Morrison read the report and felt rage building in her chest. Michael Preston had killed Richard Chen to see what it felt like. That was it. No profound motive, no complex psychological explanation, just curiosity about murder. The recovery of Richard Chen's remains took 2 days. The forensics team traveled to the coordinates Michael had provided, deep in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. They brought ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and excavation equipment. The dogs alerted almost immediately. The radar confirmed a disturbance in the soil consistent with a burial site. Sarah Morrison was present for the excavation. She felt she owed it to Richard, to his family, to bear witness to this final indignity. The remains were skeletal, 36 years of decay reducing Richard Chen to bones and fragments. But dental records would confirm what everyone already knew. They had found him. Sarah called Helen Chen personally. The woman was now 83 years old, her husband David having died from a stroke 2 years earlier. He had never gotten to know what happened to his son. Mrs. Chen, this is Detective Sarah Morrison from the Madison Police Department. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice that trembled with hope and fear, You found him. Yes, ma'am. We found Richard, and we've arrested the person responsible. Sarah drove to Chicago to deliver the news in person. She sat in Helen's living room, surrounded by photos of Richard at every age, and told her everything. Helen listened in silence until Sarah mentioned Michael Preston's name. Then her face crumpled. Michael? The word came out as a whisper. Michael, who helped search for Richard? Michael, who I thanked? Michael, who I invited to my home? I'm so sorry. Helen stood up, walked to the window, stared out at the street for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder. I want to look him in the face. I want to sit in that courtroom, and I want him to see me every single day. I want him to know what he took from me. The trial of Michael Preston began in March 2024. He was charged with first-degree intentional homicide, which carried a mandatory life sentence under Wisconsin law. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Catherine Walsh, built their case methodically. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. The genealogical analysis was explained clearly. Michael's confession was played for the jury. But Walsh wanted the jury to understand who Richard Chen had been, not just how he had died. She called Jennifer Wu, now 59 years old, to testify. Tell the jury about Richard, Walsh said gently. Jennifer's voice shook as she described the young man she had loved, his dedication to improving his violin playing, his Sunday phone calls to his parents, the way he had apologized to his neighbor about the noise, his dreams of becoming a better engineer. He was going to buy me a cello stand for Christmas, Jennifer said, tears streaming down her face. He had been saving up for it. He told me 2 weeks before he disappeared. He was so excited to surprise me. The jury heard from Tom Brennan, the senior engineer who had invited Richard for drinks that final Friday. I feel guilty about that, Tom said. If he had come with us that night instead of working late, maybe he'd still be alive. They heard from Mrs. Kowalski, the neighbor who had complained about the violin. I brought him cookies to apologize, she said, crying. He was so gracious about it, so kind, and I never got to tell him that he could practice as loud and as long as he wanted, that I was wrong to complain. The defense, led by public defender Robert Martinez, had little to work with. He challenged the validity of genealogical DNA analysis, calling expert witnesses who testified about the possibility of contamination or false matches. But the science was sound, and Michael had confessed. Martinez tried to introduce evidence of Michael's difficult childhood, suggesting that early trauma had created the psychological conditions that led to violence. Michael's mother had died when he was 12. His father had been emotionally distant, sometimes physically abusive. But the jury seemed unmoved by this explanation. Many people experienced childhood trauma. Most of them didn't become killers. The most difficult testimony came from Detective James Kowalski, now retired and 75 years old. He took the stand, looking frail but determined. I worked this case harder than any in my career, Kowalski said. I interviewed Michael Preston twice. I looked him in the eye and I believed he was innocent. I believed he was trying to help. And all that time, he was the one who had killed Richard. I missed it. I failed. Walsh approached him gently. Detective, you had no way of knowing. There was no physical evidence linking Mr. Preston to the crime in 1987. No witnesses. No motive that was apparent. You conducted a thorough investigation. But I didn't find him, Kowalski said, his voice breaking. Richard's parents died without knowing what happened to their son. That's on me. The courtroom was silent. The trial lasted 3 weeks. On April 2nd, 2024, the jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning their verdict. Guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. Michael Preston showed no reaction, He sat with his hands folded on the defense table, looking at nothing in particular. If he felt anything about the verdict, it didn't show on his face. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. This was when Helen Chen would finally get to speak. Helen Chen was 84 years old when she stood at the victim impact podium. She had prepared remarks, typed them out, and printed them so she wouldn't forget anything important. But when the moment came, she folded the paper and spoke from her heart. "My son was 24 years old when you killed him," she said, looking directly at Michael Preston. He had just started his life. He had a girlfriend who loved him. He had parents who adored him. He had dreams and plans and a future full of possibilities. You took all of that away. Michael continued staring ahead, but Sarah Morrison, watching from the gallery, saw his jaw tighten slightly. "Richard called me every Sunday," Helen continued. "For 36 years, I picked up the phone on Sunday evenings, hoping somehow he would call. Knowing he wouldn't, but hoping anyway." She paused, gathering her strength. "My husband died 2 years ago, without ever knowing what happened to our son. He spent the last years of his life wondering, always wondering. You could have given us answers at any time. You could have told us where Richard was. But you chose to let us suffer. You chose to let us die without knowing." Her voice grew stronger. "And then you pretended to be our friend. You helped search for Richard while knowing exactly where he was. You came to our house. You accepted our thanks. You let me believe you cared about my son when you were the one who had murdered him." Helen's hands gripped the podium. "I don't understand how a human being can do what you did. I don't understand how you could look into my eyes and accept my gratitude while knowing you had killed my child. That kind of cruelty is beyond my comprehension." She turned to address Judge Margaret Peterson. "Your Honor, I don't believe in the death penalty. Taking another life won't bring Richard back. But I do believe that this man should spend every remaining day of his life in prison, thinking about what he did. The same way I have spent every day for 36 years, thinking about what I lost." Judge Peterson nodded solemnly. When it was her turn to speak, she addressed Michael directly. "Mr. Preston, I have presided over many murder cases in my career, but this one is particularly disturbing because of the calculated cruelty you displayed. You didn't just kill Richard Chen. You compounded that crime by tormenting his family for decades, maintaining a facade of concern while knowing you had taken their son from them." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The law gives me only one option in cases of first-degree intentional homicide, and it's a sentence I impose without hesitation. You are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will die in prison, Mr. Preston, and that is exactly what you deserve." Michael was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. As he passed Helen Chen, he stopped for just a moment. Their eyes met. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Helen looked at him with an expression that held no forgiveness, no understanding, only profound sadness. "No, you're not. You're sorry you got caught. There's a difference." Richard Chen was laid to rest on May 11th, 2024, 36 years and 7 months after he disappeared. The funeral was held at the Chinese Baptist Church in Chicago's Chinatown, the same church where his parents had married and where Richard had been baptized as a child. More than 200 people attended: family members, friends from childhood, former classmates from the University of Illinois. Tom Brennan drove down from Wisconsin. Jennifer Wu flew in from California. Even Mrs. Kowalski, now 91 years old, made the trip from Madison in a wheelchair. The service blended Christian and Buddhist traditions, reflecting the complicated spiritual journey of the Chen family. There were hymns and prayers. There was the burning of incense and offerings of fruit. There were tears and memories and the kind of grief that comes from loss sustained over decades. Richard's younger sister, Amy, now 58, spoke about her brother. "Richard was supposed to walk me down the aisle at my wedding," she said. "He was supposed to teach my children to play violin. He was supposed to grow old and gray and embarrass his grandchildren with terrible dad jokes. All of that was stolen from us." She looked at Richard's closed casket. "But for 36 years we didn't know. We hoped, somehow, that he might still be alive, that maybe he had amnesia or was living somewhere under a different name. There was always this terrible hope that kept us from truly grieving." Amy's voice broke. "Now we can grieve. Now we can say goodbye. And as awful as that is, there's also relief. We know. Finally, we know." Helen Chen placed Richard's violin in the casket before it was sealed. The same violin he had practiced on Sunday mornings, struggling through Bach and Mozart. She had kept it for 36 years, unable to sell it or give it away. "He should have it," she told the funeral director. "Where he's going, maybe he's finally good enough to play it properly." At the graveside, as Richard's casket was lowered into the ground between the plots where his parents were buried, the minister read from Ecclesiastes, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die." Helen Chen stood between her daughter and her grandson, watching as dirt was shoveled onto the casket. She had waited 36 years for this moment, and now that it was here, she found it brought neither peace nor closure, only a bitter finality. Richard was home, but the price of bringing him home had been too high. In the aftermath of the trial, the Richard Chen case became a touchstone for discussions about genealogical DNA analysis and cold case investigations. Detective Sarah Morrison gave presentations at law enforcement conferences, explaining how the technology had cracked a case that had seemed unsolvable, but she always emphasized the human cost. "Technology gave us the answer," she would say, "but it couldn't give back the 36 years that Richard's family spent not knowing. It couldn't undo the trauma of uncertainty. Justice is important, but it's not the same as healing." Dale Kowalski, who had been a person of interest in the original investigation, contacted Sarah Morrison after the trial. "I want you to know I didn't hold it against Detective Kowalski for suspecting me," he said. "I was in a bad place back then. I owed money to bad people. I can see why I looked suspicious." "What happened with the debt?" Sarah asked. "I declared bankruptcy, destroyed my credit for years, but it got those people off my back, and I got sober. Been clean for 20 years now." Sarah was glad to hear it. One life, at least, had been salvaged from the wreckage of 1987. Tom Brennan retired from engineering and started volunteering with a victims' rights organization. "I can't stop thinking about that invitation I gave Richard," he told a reporter. "He was going to come have drinks with us the next Friday. If I had just asked him that week instead of the next, maybe he would have left work earlier that night. Maybe things would have been different." The reporter tried to tell him it wasn't his fault, but Tom shook his head. "I know that intellectually, but in my heart, I still feel like I could have changed things. I guess I'll carry that forever." Jennifer Wu never remarried, though she dated occasionally over the years. "Richard was my first real love," she said in an interview years later. "What happened to him changed how I saw the world. I became more cautious, more guarded. I don't think I ever fully trusted anyone the way I trusted him." She kept the cello stand Richard had been planning to buy her. After the trial, she finally purchased it herself, using money from a small inheritance. Every time she looked at it, She thought about the young man who had wanted to surprise her with it, who had been saving his overtime pay to make her happy. Helen Chen lived for 18 months after Richard's funeral. She died peacefully in her sleep in November 2025 at the age of 85. Her daughter Amy found her in the morning, surrounded by photos of Richard and David. "I think she was ready," Amy said. She had her answer. She could finally rest. Helen was buried between her husband and her son. Her gravestone reads, "Beloved wife, mother, and keeper of memory, now reunited with those she loved." Michael Preston remains in Columbia Correctional Institution, where he will spend the rest of his life. According to prison records, he participates in no programs, receives no visitors, and spends most of his time reading. A researcher studying violent offenders requested an interview in 2025. Michael declined. When asked why by the prison psychologist, he reportedly said, "What's the point? I don't understand what I did any better now than I did then. I just wanted to kill someone. I did it. I got caught. There's nothing deeper to explain." This lack of insight, this refusal or inability to examine his own motivations, remains perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case. Michael Preston killed Richard Chen for no reason beyond curiosity about murder. And 36 years later, sitting in a prison cell with nothing but time to think about it, he still couldn't articulate why. The Henderson Electronics building where Richard worked his last shift was demolished in 2015 to make way for a medical office complex, but there is a bench in a small park near Richard's old apartment dedicated to his memory. The plaque reads, "Richard Chen, 1963-1987. Engineer, musician, beloved son and friend. His light was stolen too soon, but it burns on in those who remember him." People sit on that bench without knowing the full story. They eat lunch there, check their phones, watch their children play. And that's appropriate. Richard's story is important, but it shouldn't define how he's remembered. He was more than a victim, more than a cold case, more than a cautionary tale about trust and evil. He was a young man who loved Bach and Mozart, even though he couldn't play them very well, who called his parents every Sunday because he knew they worried, who apologized to his neighbor for making noise and felt genuinely happy when she brought him cookies, who worked overtime to save money for dreams that would never be realized. He was a person, and that's what matters most. The case of Richard Chen reminds us that justice, while crucial, cannot restore what has been lost. Helen and David Chen got answers after 36 years, but those answers came too late to bring peace to their lives. They died carrying the weight of not knowing, even though the truth was eventually revealed. But the case also demonstrates that some crimes, no matter how much time has passed, will not be forgotten. Advances in technology, combined with the dedication of investigators like Sarah Morrison and genealogists like Patricia Weaver, meant that Michael Preston's secret couldn't stay buried forever. Richard Chen was found. His killer was brought to justice. And while that can't undo 36 years of anguish, it matters. It has to matter. Because if it doesn't, we live in a world where truth is irrelevant and justice is impossible. We don't live in that world. We live in a world where a detective cared enough about a case from before she was born to pursue every possible lead, where scientific advances made the impossible possible, where a family finally got to bring their son home. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's something. And sometimes, when the alternative is eternal silence and unanswered questions, something is everything.